Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Been advised by people who know how these microphones work not to touch the microphone, not to adjust it, so I'm just going to leave it exactly where it is, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I just thought before I start, I'd just give a brief introduction. I think I've probably spoken to everyone in the room, but if I haven't spoken to you, my name's Paul. I've been coming to church in the barn for just over 2 years. I'm one of the house group leaders here, which is a real privilege, and this is my second sort of time I've been invited to come and give God's word, and it's a real privilege and honour to be able to do that this evening. Tonight we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 3, and I'm actually suffering with a little bit of a sore throat, so Inez is going to come up and she's going to read from Daniel chapter 3, and then I'm going to come back up and just unpack a little bit from that chapter.
Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they had heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews who you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisers, "Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisers crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut to pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
Thank you, Inez. It's quite a lot to unpack in that chapter. So I'm going to make sure I've got a timer on, so I won't be speaking all night. You'll be relieved to hear. So, just before we sort of start to unpack chapter 3, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of wider context of the book of Daniel. For those of you who aren't so familiar with the book of Daniel, it's split into 12 chapters, and the first 6 chapters are basically the biographical story of Daniel and his friends, and basically the persecution that they experienced as Jews in the land of Babylon. And then the second half of the book, chapters 7 to 12, they are the visions and the dreams that Daniel experienced, and that they are sort of interspersed alongside the sort of biographical storyline. So I think we've got, don't know, could you mind putting a first slide up? I don't know how easy that will be to see. That's a DIY job, but that kind of just hopefully gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the timeline of the book of Daniel. So I've only put the first 6 books there, or first 6 chapters, because the second half of the book, that's kind of interspersed in amongst the chapters 1 to 6, and it's a bit harder to timestamp. But you can see there that Daniel was born, and then Daniel was taken to Babylon in we think around 605 BC, and that's where the book of Daniel starts. So the book of Daniel starts in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and it's kind of interesting. His name, Jehoiakim, means Yahweh raises up. But he was actually installed on the throne by Pharaoh. So it wasn't God who put him on the throne, it was Pharaoh. And Nebuchadnezzar wasn't king at the time, so his father was king, and Nebuchadnezzar had basically overthrown the Assyrian Empire. He'd led the Babylonian armies to overthrow the Assyrians. And then the Egyptians come in after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, and they attack Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar leads the Babylonian armies to drive the Egyptians back. They defeat them. And then Nebuchadnezzar drives the Egyptians all the way back to Egypt. And it's believed that on the way back from Egypt, he attacked Jerusalem because of Jehoiakim and the people of Judah being loyal to Egypt. His attack on Jerusalem was probably cut short because of the death of his father. So Nebuchadnezzar wasn't king, his father was king, and his father passed away, so Nebuchadnezzar had to rush back to Babylon to ensure that he secured the throne. But basically, after this first attack that Nebuchadnezzar had on Jerusalem, he basically took all the best and the young, bright, talented young men from Jerusalem, and he took them back to Jerusalem, and that included Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the idea was they would be indoctrinated into the Babylonian culture and customs, and they would be basically prepared for a life of working in the Babylonian kind of administrative system, in their kind of civil service. And you can read about, in the first couple of chapters of Daniel, how they kind of get on, and some of the potential points where they could have been put to death, but actually God comes through and God saves them. So we pick up the story in chapter 3, and we're going to talk quite a lot about chapter 2. It's hard to not talk about chapter 2 when talking about chapter 3, because there seems to be, it's hard to be 100% certain, but there seems to be an obvious link between the two. So in chapter 2 of Daniel, we read that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and this dream troubles his mind, and he summons all his wise advisors. He summons his magicians, his astrologers, his sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. And he basically says, you've got to tell me what my dream's about, and you've got to interpret it for me. And to us today, we're probably thinking, that seems like quite a big ask, that Nebuchadnezzar's not telling him what his dream's about. He's saying, no, you've got to tell me what the dream's about, and then you've got to interpret it. But actually, these people, these advisors of the king, they were claiming to have the ability to contact the gods. They were claiming to have influence and be able to interact with the spiritual realm. They were claiming that they could predict the future. So actually, what Nebuchadnezzar was asking from them wasn't that difficult if they were who they claimed to be. We actually read in chapter 2 how actually when pushed by Nebuchadnezzar, they said, actually, King Nebuchadnezzar, what you're asking for, no one can do that. No one on earth can tell you what your dream's about and then interpret it. And we actually read that, we know that's not true, right? And we read that, and that's exactly when Daniel comes onto the scene. He enters the story, and Daniel says to King Nebuchadnezzar, can I have some time? And then Daniel goes away, prays to God, pleads with God with his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And God gives them the dream. He gives Daniel the dream, and he gives him the interpretation. And then Daniel goes back and he interprets that dream for Nebuchadnezzar. Would you mind just putting the next slide on, please? The one with the statue. Thank you. There we go. I don't know how clear that is to see, but this is basically the statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreams about. So it is a statue with a head made of pure gold. It's a chest and arms of silver, and belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. Now we're told in Daniel chapter 2 that the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar. God tells Daniel Daniel that the head is Nebuchadnezzar, and that the other parts of this statue refer to inferior kingdoms that will follow after the Babylonian kingdom. Many interpret the statue as follows. So the chest of arms of silver possibly being the Medo-Persian Empire that follows. They take over from the Babylonians. They invade Babylon. And you can read about that actually in Daniel chapter 5. The belly and thighs of bronze, that may be a reference to the Greek Empire. They defeated the Medo-Persian Empire under Alexander the Great. So these kingdoms, they're following one after another. The legs of iron, they could refer to the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire took over from the Greek Empire. So again, it's these empires following on one after another. And then when you get to the feet, there tends to be a little bit more difference in opinion, I guess, where because the feet are partly of iron, there seems to be this idea that maybe it's connected with the Roman Empire somehow. But we don't need to get too bogged down in that. But as you work down the statue, the metals grow in strength, so the metals are getting stronger, but they diminish in value. And that could be a reflection of the fact that the subsequent empires, though they were larger and they lasted longer than the Babylonian Empire, they were inferior in many respects, particularly in their treatment of the people of Israel. And these subsequent empires, for example, they had a much greater dependence on military might to control the people under their dominion. Whereas in the Babylonian Empire, it seemed that actually, that Daniel was able to, and his friends had a freedom to be able to pray, and they had a freedom to be able to worship their God. They didn't have to submit to Babylonian gods. So now we land in chapter 3, and as Inez read, we've got Nebuchadnezzar, and he has built this image. And we don't know why he has built this image of gold. It seems possible that he's building in response to the dream that he had in chapter 2. And we don't know why he's building it all of gold, because in the dream he's told he's just the head of gold. It's possible that he is just almost pushing back against the dream and the interpretation and saying, I think I'm going to live forever. I think my empire is going to go on and on and on, and it's not going to, it's not going to fade away. That's maybe one way of reading it. And it's interesting because at the end of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar does seem like he's on the verge of becoming a follower of God, because he says in verse 47, "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." And that secret he's referring to, that's a dream that he had. So, it seems like those words were maybe slightly hollow, because we find him here in chapter 3 actually saying, no, I'm going to build this image, and it's going to be all of gold. And it seems to be that it's building an image for himself, and it's glorifying himself. And kind of Nebuchadnezzar, if we kind of unpack a little bit more about him, actually in the eyes of himself and in the eyes of many in the world, he has achieved greatness. As I've touched on already, he led the Babylonian armies to overthrow the Assyrians, and he then went to decisively defeat the Egyptians. So there was this power vacuum after the Assyrian Empire collapsed, and the Egyptians would try to come in and take over, and he ensured that Babylon won out, and he defeated the Egyptians. He redeveloped the city of Babylon. He increased its significance and its splendor, and as a city, it's believed it was probably the first city to exceed a population of 200,000 people. And it was spread over 200 square miles, which is about 4 times the size of modern-day Jerusalem, or about the size of Leeds, if you want a reference point closer to home. I think we've got an illustration of the city of Babylon. There we go. So that's obviously just an illustration, but it gives you some idea of maybe what the city was like. And a lot of this was, built by Nebuchadnezzar's often referred to as a builder. He did a lot of building work that actually for a long period of his reign, actually there was a lot of peace, and actually he was able to get on with very big building projects. So the walled city was 60 miles in circumference, and the city walls were believed to be 150 feet high, which is about the same height as the Statue of Liberty. And then the walls were 87 feet thick. So just to give you some idea of context, the tennis court is 78 feet long. So these walls are thicker than a tennis court is long. You could have 4 chariots riding alongside each other along the top of these city walls, which would be probably quite an impressive sight. Around the city you had a 30-foot moat, and you had canals supplying fresh water into the city. And the Babylonians very much saw it as a city that was impregnable, which ultimately proved to not be the case if you kind of read into how the Persians invaded. The Assyrian Empire that the Nebuchadnezzar and his father defeated, that had lasted for almost 1,500 years. And it seems very much like Nebuchadnezzar has plans to establish a kingdom and an empire that's going to match that in longevity. But as we will read and as we find and know from history, that actually God had other plans. It's worth noting that we're not actually told what this image was that he constructed. So because of the link with, or the possible link with chapter 2, it's often portrayed in, I guess, art and sort of imagery that it took on a human form, but the sort of customary thing would for it to have been an obelisk. I think we have a picture of an obelisk. There we go. So this is actually an Assyrian obelisk, and this is from around 241 years before the Book of Daniel. And this is relatively small. It's less than 2 meters in height. But so we're not quite sure. It might have been an obelisk. It might have taken a statue, like a human form. It might have taken some other form. We don't really know. But this is kind of what would have been, I guess, more customary. The image is described as being made purely of gold. It probably wasn't completely made of gold, just due to the size of it and the amount of gold that would have been required and how heavy that would have been. So it's more like it was made of wood or something like that, and it was plated in gold. We read that the height of the image is about 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. We're not told how deep it is, but I've kind of just assume it was 9 feet wide. So I guess a little bit like this obelisk here, that actually it's the same depth as it is width. So for comparison, I think we've got a picture of the Angel of the North. There we go. So the Angel of the North, as you can see, I don't know how easy it is to see, but it's 20 meters high, whereas Nebuchadnezzar's statue was about 27 meters, or his image was about 27 meters high. So it's a bit bigger, quite a bit bigger than the Angel of the North, and a little bit smaller than Carlisle Cathedral. Just to give you some idea of a scale and perspective, I'm sure it took a little while to build this image. It probably wasn't built overnight. Maths wasn't my strongest subject at school, but I did try and do some maths. So there's a picture of like an orange bar. No. It's like 2 columns. One of them's like orangey gold, like a goldy colour. No, it's okay. I'll just tell you the maths. So we had the obelisk before. I think basically it would have, if he built another obelisk, but it was just 90 feet high, then it would have taken about 468 of the smaller obelisk that we had on the screen before. So it's quite big. Or if you had 14 people of my height, one on top of another, that gives you close to an idea of how tall this thing was. So it was big. And then what we read about is actually that it seems that anyone of importance in the Babylonian Empire was called, summoned to this dedication. But curiously, we have no mention of Daniel, and there's no explanation as to his whereabouts. He may have been attending the king's business elsewhere. He was in a very senior position. I think all the wise men in Babylon were under him, so it may have just been that he was in a position where he didn't have to do all the things that the other wise men had to do, or he was beyond reproach. We don't really know. But yeah, there's no mention of Babylon in, no mention of Daniel in this story. And yeah, as Babylon was the world superpower of the day, there was a lot of people involved in the sort of administrative system to keep things running smoothly. And yeah, we're probably talking of a crowd of hundreds of people being gathered at the dedication, possibly even thousands of people, and people traveling days, weeks to come to this dedication. So it's going to be quite a big event. It would have been, I guess what we might say a three-line whip. You know, if you were in a position of authority, you would have had to be there. I think most of the job titles that were kind of read out, we're probably familiar with in terms of like treasurers, judges, and magistrates. A satrap, I may have not said that right, but they are governor of a province. So within Babylon, you had different provinces, and so a satrap would have been someone who's representing or a governor of one of those provinces. So you would have had people coming. They were basically the king's representatives in different parts of the kingdom, and they had a lot of responsibility. And it kind of seems that with calling all these people to this event, that it's almost like a test of allegiance, that actually Nebuchadnezzar wants everyone here, and he wants to be sure that they are all going to pledge allegiance to him, that they're not going to submit to someone else. They are loyal to him and to his gods, and not to someone else and someone else's gods. Would you mind putting the first, perfect, there we go. So that's a lot of text and it's quite small. But yeah, you just at the bottom there, you've got a list of some of the instruments. This is quite an impressive set of instruments. And that probably adds to a sense that this was a very kind of religious act. Could we have the universal picture, please? Yeah, okay. So I was trying to think of a bit of an analogy for this, and this is the one I came up with. I'm not sure it's a very good one, but anyway. So I think most people here will recognize this logo. This is Universal Pictures. They make films and TV shows and other things like that. So if you're watching a film, just before the film starts, you'll see Universal Pictures, and I'll be saying, hey, this is a Universal Pictures film. And if you've ever seen this, you'll be familiar. There's quite a triumphant kind of musical piece that goes with it, and I quite like it. It sort of gets you quite excited, and it's like, oh yeah, it's time for the film. And this, I think, is what the effect of Nebuchadnezzar having all these instruments and all these people in this kind of orchestra kind of setup, which is, it's like, stop what you're doing. You've got to respond. There's a moment where you got to be like, okay, now we've got to do something. So with Universal, it's like, stop scrolling on your phone or eating popcorn or chatting to whoever's next to you. The film's about to start. Focus on the screen. And I think that's kind of something similar to what is going on here. That actually, the music's playing. It's now time to bow down and worship this image. If we could go back to that first, perfect. We can see there in verse 6 that there is a very real threat that accompanies this command. Nebuchadnezzar is seeing this personally. If you don't comply, this is an act of treason. He's taking it as a personal affront, and you're going to be thrown into a burning furnace. And I think for me, just one of the things reading through this, I was just sort of thinking, I don't have people in the world telling me, go and bow down to this 90-foot idol or this 90-foot image of some description. But there are things that the world tells us that we need to bow down to, or there's things that the world tells us we need to submit to this. And I think just that reminder that actually, we've got to be careful to not necessarily follow in the ways of the world. So we see here that all the people, apart from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they bow down to this statue. So even though you've got people coming from different parts of the Babylonian Empire, they had different religious beliefs, different gods, but when it came to it, they bowed down and they said, I'm just going to not take any risks. I'm going to bow down and just keep the king happy. And I think just that reminder that actually sometimes, if we're put in similar positions, that actually we've got to hold our ground like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and say, actually, I'm going to be faithful to God rather than faithful to man. Could we put verses 8 to 12 on, please? Or 18, I think. There we go. I think that's even smaller, sorry. So it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if it was in the translation Inez read, but we've got here the Chaldeans, and we've met them before. We meet them in chapter 2, and these were some of the wise men who failed to tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was. They were ones who told Nebuchadnezzar, no one in the world can tell you what your dream is about, and no one can interpret it. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting that the same people potentially are cropping up here in chapter 3. So in chapter 2, they've kind of been shown up a little bit by God and by Daniel. And off the back of that, Daniel's promoted, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are given, privileged positions, important positions within the Babylonian court. And I wonder if maybe they were still smarting a little bit from that, the Chaldeans, and they're thinking there's an opportunity for us here to potentially get our own back, to get a bit of revenge, to maybe get our these Jewish young Jewish men out of the way. And I thought it was interesting as well that actually Nebuchadnezzar didn't notice that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not bowing down. That actually it was the Chaldeans who had to bring it to Nebuchadnezzar's attention. And it may just be that actually that is because there was just lots of people there, hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people gathered. But it was very much like actually Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were there, they were doing their thing, they were being faithful to God. And it was the Chaldeans who kind of dropped them in it and brought it to the king's attention. They were kind of tickling the king's ear with expressions like, may the king live forever. And we don't hear that kind of language from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because it's not true. They know the king will not live forever because there's only one king who does live forever. I think also it's kind of interesting that Nebuchadnezzar seems to make a direct challenge to God. So he says, and who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Again, it seems to be that this man has forgotten the events of chapter 2, or maybe his words were just slightly more hollow. But he did say in chapter 2, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets. But we find him here then challenging God again, saying, I know you've got this God who can reveal this dream, but I don't think this God's going to save you from this fiery furnace. And he's just testing, he's just pushing up and testing God, and it doesn't end well for him. So the response from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is kind of interesting. They could have responded in a few different ways. They could have formalized a complaint to the king. They could have said, this is unfair, this is unjust. They could have tried to make excuses, or they could have just caved in. Nebuchadnezzar gave them a second chance to bow down. He said, look, if you bow down, it's all good, it's fine. We'll forget about the first attempt. If you bow down now, it's okay. They just seemed very calm and composed in their response. They picked their words carefully, and they were clear to Nebuchadnezzar, and they got to the point that they would not serve any other gods or worship the gold image set before them. As much as they could, they were honoring and respectful to Nebuchadnezzar. They addressed him as king, and they got straight to the point. They didn't feel the need to tickle his ear like the Chaldeans did. Just this reminder, going back to chapter 2 again. So we read in chapter 2 that the God of heaven, who had given him being Nebuchadnezzar, his kingdom, power, strength, and glory. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they've not forgotten that it is God who has given Nebuchadnezzar his kingdom, his power, his strength, and his glory. That is Nebuchadnezzar who has, it's God who has allowed Nebuchadnezzar to get to the point where he is at, and he has blessed him with all the things that he's blessed him with. But Nebuchadnezzar's forgotten all that, and Nebuchadnezzar's thinking, this is all off my own back, it's all off my own wisdom and achievements. And just kind of interesting that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were still very much honouring and respectful to Nebuchadnezzar. And we kind of read throughout the book of Daniel how Daniel and his friends remain faithful to God, and they're uncompromising. But they're also respectful, and they are submitting to human leadership. They submit to Nebuchadnezzar. They serve faithfully in Nebuchadnezzar's court and in the Babylonian administrative system. And I think Nebuchadnezzar probably quite liked these guys before the point where they're not bowing down to his image. I think they would have been serving diligently, and they would have been working hard. And I think Nebuchadnezzar gave them that second chance to bow down, probably because he was like, I kind of like you guys. I want to make sure that you guys don't make a silly mistake here. But like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have reached a point where they're saying, well, I can't be faithful to man without compromising on my faithfulness to God. And I guess that's something for us that actually ultimately our faithfulness has got to be to God first and foremost. And that doesn't mean to say that we can't submit. We should submit to the authority of man, but there comes a point where we can't necessarily do that without compromising on our faithfulness to God. And at that point, I guess that's where we get potentially those fiery furnace moments that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. What we kind of see here, and this is, one of my favourite kind of probably conversations in Scripture really, is with their response to Nebuchadnezzar. And they say, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. And it's clear that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have the confidence that God can deliver them, and that God is faithful to those who are faithful to him. And I think we can have that same confidence when we're facing trials and tribulations and potentially fiery furnaces, not necessarily literal fiery furnaces, but fiery furnaces in our own lives. But their response does kind of caveat that even though they believe that God has the power to deliver them, that they're not quite sure how God's going to work out his plan through this situation and through their lives. So even though they maybe they believe God can deliver them, and they're not maybe quite sure what that's going to look like. So I guess me being I think a relatively optimistic person, I'd like to think that the deliverance would come before the fiery furnace. So I don't know if a massive rain shower would somehow, drive everyone inside or put the flames out or something like that, or whether Nebuchadnezzar falls down dead or something like that, and in the chaos, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get away from the fiery furnace. But I'd like to think that, the deliverance would come before the fiery furnace. But I think there's an acknowledgement from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that they don't know how God's going to work out that situation. And actually, there is a chance that they are going to die, and I guess in some respects there is deliverance in death as well. But that probably wasn't what they were hoping for. They were probably hoping to be able to live and survive. And the Bible, throughout the Bible, we see kind of examples of where God intervenes in incredible ways, and in ways where it's unexplainable, and you can only put it down to divine intervention. And I guess the one of the examples that comes to mind is the Israelites escaping from Egypt, and the parting of the Red Sea. And you're just thinking, there's divine intervention there. It's clear that God has intervened there to save his people. But we see in other places, other parts of the Bible, and also in people's lives and testimonies, that sometimes God does withhold his power and his people do suffer. And so I guess there's an element of, like, even though Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had that confidence that God can save them and God can deliver them, that it may not be exactly what they are hoping for or expecting, but they trust God anyway, and they have complete confidence in him. Would we mind moving on to the next, so verses 19 to 25? Thank you. So, whereas we saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I think, being relatively calm given the circumstances in their response to Nebuchadnezzar, they got to the point, they seemed fairly calm and collected. It seems that Nebuchadnezzar kind of loses his head a little bit here. We already know that he's furious. It says in verse 13 that he is furious, but he then gets to a point of saying, we need to heat the furnace 7 times hotter than it's normally heated. Whenever you see 7 in the Bible, it's signifying completion or perfection. So it's more likely that the furnace was actually just being heated as hot as it could be heated. But without going into too many details, that was completely unnecessary. Like, I think the furnace would have been hot enough as it was. And in his haste to have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego put to death, they were thrown in with their clothes on. Ordinarily, prisoners would have been stripped of their clothing before being thrown in. But like the superheated furnace, this just serves as a greater demonstration of God's protective power. So the men carrying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were instantly killed by the flames, and yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't. They were thrown into the fire. They were alive when they were being thrown into the fire. The flames had no power to harm them because they were under the protection of God. And you contrast that with the fact that Nebuchadnezzar's men died instantly, just being close to the flames, and Nebuchadnezzar was unable to protect them. I think this is just a further evidence, really, that there's no possible way or possible explanation other than divine intervention in the deliverance of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they've been thrown into the furnace, and almost instantly Nebuchadnezzar jumps up and identifies that there's a fourth man walking around in the in the furnace. So all the men are walking around. So remember that they've been bound up, that probably some of the best men in the king's army, King Nebuchadnezzar's army, have bound these Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up. They've been thrown into the furnace, and yet almost instantly they're walking around, and there's a fourth man alongside them. And his form is described like the Son of God. Now, we can't be sure who this fourth man is. It could be an angel. Nebuchadnezzar supposes it's an angel in verse 28, which we'll get to in a moment. It could have been a physical appearance of Christ before his incarnation. I guess when we read about the Son of God, that is who we sort of think of. It probably doesn't really matter whether it was an angel or whether it was the Son of, whether it was Jesus. The point is, it's a physical demonstration of God's presence with believers in their distress. And it's a literal fulfillment of God's promise in Isaiah 43, verse 2, which I'll just read out. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. Could you move on to verses 26, please? Thank you. Yeah, I think it's just incredible. Like, we talked a little bit about it already, but these men have been bound up, and they're wearing their clothes, they've been thrown in, and then they're walking around, and then they can walk out on their own accord from this fiery furnace. And I mean, it goes into, it's just incredible. Like, it says that there was no, the fire had no power, the hair of their head was not singed, nor their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. We had a barbecue and a fire pit for an 1830s get-together last summer. And I didn't think I'd spent that much time next to the fire, and I certainly wasn't getting that close to the fire. But I got home and my clothes stank of smoke and fire. And I think probably most people who've been close to a fire can probably share a similar experience, that you don't have to spend that much time next to a fire for your clothes to stink. And I think it's just incredible, and just further demonstration of God's incredible deliverance, that actually, their hair wasn't singed, their clothes were unaffected, and there was no smell on them. So just to kind of wrap all this up, I think one of the things, just a couple of things really, that I've kind of drawn out from this chapter. So if we are faithful to God, then we can be confident, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that he has the power to deliver us from whatever situation we might be facing. Sometimes that deliverance is not going to be what we expect, and it's not always, God's not always going to intervene for reasons that we can't always fathom, but we can have that confidence that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have, that God does have the power to deliver those who are faithful to him. As I touched on a little bit before, I don't think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego probably thought their deliverance would come in the fiery furnace. I think they were probably hoping for deliverance before that point. Certainly, if I was in a similar situation, I'd be hoping for deliverance before that point. But I think that reminder that actually, even when we are in the fiery furnace, that God is there with us, that God sends that physical representation, that fourth man walking around in the fiery furnace, that God is there with us in the fiery furnace. And I think that's just a huge encouragement for each and every one of us, that even when we are in we're facing trials, and we are facing pressure and persecution, and when we are maybe facing a fiery furnace in our own lives, that actually God is there with us, and he's not just there onlooking, but he's there in the middle of the fiery furnace with us. I think the other thing is that actually no other God can save in this way. That's the words of Nebuchadnezzar. There is no other God who can save us from the fiery furnaces of life. There's other things in this world. I guess you might say other gods or other idols that may claim to be able to save you or to be able to help you get through life. But ultimately, they're always going to fall short. As we see in the story, Nebuchadnezzar was unable to protect his own men. This is a man who was probably the most powerful man on the planet at that time. You know, he had money, he had possessions, he had big armies, he had an empire, and yet he was unable to protect his men from the furnace. And just that reminder really that against God he stood no chance, and that actually we are with God, and when we're with God that we are in God's hands, and we are in very good hands. We're in the best hands. So just to finish, if there's anyone here tonight, or I guess online, who doesn't know the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, or if you're not sure if you do, I would encourage you to speak to someone tonight, or to get in touch with the church. I'm around at the end of the service, but there's also the elders of the church, or just grab anyone, just talk to anyone. And I think the other thing is if you feel like you're facing trials or tribulations, if you're maybe feel like you're almost in a fiery furnace yourself, or you are maybe feeling like you're being pushed towards a fiery furnace, then please, do seek prayer at the end of the service. I think anyone in this room would be more than happy to pray with you. I think as we look back on the story of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they were facing that furnace together. They had God with them, but there was also, they had each other. And I think there's something in that for us as well, that we don't necessarily, even though we know that God is with us in trials and tribulations, that we also are placed in community with fellow believers, and that actually, we're there to journey with one another through those trials and tribulations as well. Thank you.